case folks online are missing something that is not working right.
Gotcha. So I'll go for you.
Okay. Oh, this thing works. I have a brother named Mike, and so there's a certain familiarity. Can you move over there? Does that work? Thank you. Hearing my own voice is going to throw me, but welcome to See You on the Weekend. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here. We're really excited about a lecture today. We have, it's titled Protecting Antarctica, Science, Diplomacy, and Storytelling from the Bottom of the World. This lecture is brought to you by the Office for Outreach and Engagement. Our speaker is Professor Cassandra Brooks. My name is David Means, and I'll be the moderator today. Hey, Kevin, good to see you. I'm the director of the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which produces this series. And if anyone had trouble getting here today, I can completely relate. So thanks for bearing with as we get going here. And thanks so much to my team. I have to say the Office for Outreach and Engagement, which I just mentioned, the staff that helps put these things on, they are impeccable in the things that they do, and they make all these things possible. So thank you so much to our team. I want to extend my gratitude to the offices of the Chancellor and the Provost and the Division of Continuing Education for funding See You on the Weekend and making all our work at the Office for Outreach and Engagement possible. Just a few logistics before we get started. We're together in person today, but we also are joined by a number of online attendees. For online folks, you can submit questions throughout the talk using the question and answer or Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. I think I'm looking at you if I look over here. Yep. So whenever we turn to Q&A, Professor Brooks and I will work together to balance questions from the in-person audience as well as the folks online to make sure that everyone is included in our conversation. So those of you who are in person, feel free to raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. We appreciate it if you wait to ask your question or pose your comment until a microphone gets to you, because then everyone online as well as in the room will be able to hear the question as well as the response. Closed captioning is available to those attending online. You can turn that on using the CC button, which is at the bottom of your Zoom window. The online version of this lecture is being recorded and will be made available on the website early this coming week. That's the same website where you registered for this event. All right, so with the logistics out of the way and me catching my breath, to the reason we're here, I want to welcome Professor Amanda Carrico, who is the chair of the Environmental Studies program, to introduce Professor Brooks.
Thank you so much. It's really a joy to be here. Thank you all for coming out on this gorgeous Saturday. It's great to be here for this event, and also a real pleasure to have the chance to introduce my colleague, Dr. Cassandra Brooks, to you all today. So Cassandra is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies Department here at CU. She's an interdisciplinary engaged scholar who works across marine science and international environmental policy, largely focusing on protecting the waters around Antarctica, as you'll hear more about. Professor Brooks is also an accomplished science communicator and was a core member of The Last Ocean, a grand-scale media project focusing on protecting the Ross Sea, Antarctica. Her work, as she'll talk more about today, helped drive the adoption of the world's largest marine protected area in the Ross Sea in 2016. I can tell you for sure, as someone who works in the environmental field, we don't get that many wins, right? So it's really exciting to hear about these wins and to have a chance to really study them, learn from them, and understand the historical context around them. So since 2012, Professor Brooks directly participates in Antarctic policy as a scientific committee, as a scientific committee on Antarctic research delegate and annual meetings of the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. Her current Antarctic marine conservation projects are funded by the Pew Charitable Trust, NASA, the National Science Foundation, including a recent National Science Foundation Career Award. These are extremely prestigious awards for early career scholars. And this is to study ecology of Antarctic toothfish in the Ross Sea. She has received a Switzer Environmental Leadership Award, Society of Women Geographers Jackie Rohn Award, Explorers Club 50 Honor, the Association for Environmental Studies and Sciences Early Career Award, as well as CU Boulder's Excellence in Service and Leadership Award and Outstanding Faculty Mentor Award. There's a lot of awards there. Others, I think, as well that we're not mentioning. Through her teaching, which is largely focused on environmental governance and conservation solutions, she seeks to empower the next generation of environmental leaders. And I can also tell you, as a close colleague of Cassandra, she's a beloved instructor to our students and an extremely treasured colleague in the Environmental Studies Department. So please join me in welcoming Cassandra, and I'll hand it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay in the room and on Zoom? Awesome. I do really want to thank you for spending part of your Saturday with me, and a shout out to folks I can see from my department, students that I've worked with, and friends and family for being here today. Thank you so much. So I always need to start by taking you to Antarctica. Who in the room has been to this southern continent? A few of you, wonderful. Well, I want to share with you that before the continent was actually discovered, so before we even knew it existed, the ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the north. They said without it, the entire world would topple over. And I love this metaphor because, as we now know, Antarctica, rightly placed in the center of the map, is critical to the functioning of Earth's systems. It regulates our climate, storing disproportionate amounts of heat and carbon. It drives global ocean circulation, as you can see through the figure behind me. And it stores fresh water, keeping our sea level where it's at. And despite its incredibly harsh conditions, Antarctic waters are below the point of freezing. They actually teem with life. And in fact, Antarctica contains some of our last healthy marine ecosystems left on the planet. The reason for that is that this place, which is so far away, has largely been protected by ice and remoteness, but also political will. In the Antarctic, we have this amazing history of exploration and science that has created a unique framework for international collaboration and data sharing, where it allows for scientists to work side by side despite diplomatic tensions at home. And there were incredible diplomatic tensions in Antarctica. This is a map of Antarctica from 1942, where countries had mapped the continent and divided it up like a pie. You had 7 different countries that had sovereignty claims, including ones that were overlapping in the Antarctic Peninsula region. And then you had, of course, the United States and USSR reserving the right to claim the whole entire thing. And in the 1940s, we had this period of time where there was this militarization happening of Antarctica. This is just one operation. It was Operation High Jump that the United States Navy conducted, where they had this overinflated military after World War II, and it was during the Cold War. So they wanted to train soldiers to fight in the Siberian-like conditions so that they could fight in the high Russian areas. And this one operation sent 4,700 soldiers, as well as vessels and aircraft, to Antarctica. And of course, in the midst of this, we had these Cold War tensions, we had the satellite races, the arms races, and this real fear that these Northern Hemisphere countries would use Antarctica as a launching pad for nuclear war in the Southern Hemisphere, right? And then they had this period of time in the midst of this where we were building this international science collaboration under the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58. This was a focused year on Antarctica, Antarctic science, and there were 12 different countries involved, and they all were going to work together in Antarctica. And those 12 countries actually came together through that scientific collaboration and formed a political collaboration through the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. The treaty is absolutely amazing. It sets aside the entire continent for the sake of peace and science. It prohibits nuclear activities. It prohibits military activities. It's actually our first post-World War II arms limitation agreement in the United States. And Antarctica is now one of our largest nuclear-free zones in the world. It also, all those sovereignty claims I shared with you, it suspends all of those, really creating Antarctica as an international space. And later agreements actually banned mining and designated Antarctica as a natural reserve. And I have to stop for a minute to highlight how amazing this is. We haven't done anything like this anywhere else in the world, where we had these incredible diplomatic tensions, these incredible differences, these power struggles. And rather than turning Antarctica to a place of militarization and sovereignty, we set it aside as a global commons. It really is like a de facto world park, and it's one of our greatest achievements. Now, under the Antarctic Treaty System is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR, and they govern the waters around Antarctica. In line with the principles of the treaty, grounded in science and precaution, CAMLR is considered a leader in marine resource management. They currently have 27 countries pictured by the flags behind me, and hopefully I'm not blocking these nice pictures that I'll be showing you. And all decisions are made by unanimous consensus, which means that every single country has to agree for a policy decision to be made. They make their decisions in this building in Hobart, Tasmania, Australia. Every single October, they meet for a 2-week period. So you really have this one moment a year where countries gather in this building to make policy decisions. Now, part of the reason why CAMLR is considered a leader is that they have this amazing convention which demands that they take a precautionary, science-based ecosystem approach to management. And under the convention, conservation includes rational use, which means fishing is allowed, but it has to be, again, in this precautionary manner for it to continue. There are 2 main fisheries in the Southern Ocean at the different ends of the food spectrum, Antarctic krill, which are the key prey species, and toothfish, the top fish predator. Antarctic krill are potentially the most abundant animal on Earth in terms of biomass, and they feed a massive amount of animals in Antarctica. That's why we have those large populations of penguins and whales that come down there. They also support the largest fishery in the Southern Ocean by far. And you don't have to feel bad when I ask you this question, but how many of you eat Antarctic krill? None of you, huh? I don't believe you, because they are actually largely harvested not for us to eat directly, but for fish meal. So to feed pigs and chickens, also to feed aquaculture operations, to feed fish that we grow. And then they're increasingly sold as omega-3 pills. And if you can see from this picture, they're actually marketed as being from the pristine waters of Antarctica. Like, these are krill oil that you want to eat because they're healthy for you. So now, how many of you think you've eaten Antarctic krill? Probably most of you. It's okay. The other thing about krill, so it's increasingly growing because of these markets that are growing. It's also growing more concentrated. And the maps behind me show you this trend where the upper left corner is from the 1980s and 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and all the way to 2020, 2021. And the spectrum is from green to red, where red is more concentrated fishing. And hopefully what you can see is that over time, if you look at the 80s and 90s, fishing for krill was happening throughout the Southern Ocean. And over those decades, it's gotten more and more concentrated, where now in recent years, it's heavily, heavily concentrated in this Antarctic Peninsula region, which is also near the the Scotia Sea. And you can see that concentrated red area. And part of the reason for that is that we're having reductions in sea ice, so the vessels can get in closer and closer. And the problem with that is that they're increasingly overlapping where penguins forage, where whales forage, where other animals need to feed on krill. The other reason this matters is that many of you probably know that we used to have abundance of whales across the world's oceans, and they were harvested heavily. And one of the last places that they were harvested was the Southern Ocean. After people decimated whales everywhere else, they came south, and they quickly removed an estimated 90% of the whales from the Southern Ocean. So in blue is that biomass of whales going down, and red is that harvest of whales. The amazing thing that's happening now, though, is if you look at the end of that blue tail, is that whales are starting to increase, and they're really starting to recover in Antarctica, which is incredible. But what does this mean? So this is a study that just came out this year showing the largest fin whale aggregation seen since the recovery of whales in the Southern Ocean. Absolutely amazing. But what they also were finding is that these krill vessels, which you can see behind the whales, are actually starting to target those whale aggregations. So as the whales are recovering in massive amounts, the fishing vessels can see them. They know that there's krill there that they're feeding on, and then they actually fish pretty much like you can see in this picture on top of that whale aggregation. In addition to that, since 2021, we've also seen some juvenile humpback whales get caught directly in fishing nets and die from it. So we're having this increasing tension over fishing in the Southern Ocean. Now, krill being the key prey species, Antarctic toothfish and Patagonian toothfish are the top fish predator in the Southern Ocean. You can see how massive they are. They grow in excess of 2 meters and 140 kilograms. They're an absolutely amazing deep dwelling fish caught at deeper than 2,000 meters. And besides the fact that they're a really important predator species, and just to share that in Antarctica, we don't have sharks. So toothfish are often seen as like the shark of the Antarctic, like they're filling that role in the Southern Ocean. But they're also a really important prey species. This is a Weddell seal with a toothfish in its mouth. And it's not just for seals, but also whales that toothfish are a really important prey item for. So I told you there's a fishery for toothfish. So how many of you eat toothfish? And it's okay, you can tell me. A couple of you do. How many of you eat Chilean sea bass or have heard of it or eaten it? How many of you eat Chilean sea bass? So toothfish are not sold as toothfish because I guess that's not a very attractive name. So they're sold as Chilean sea bass. They're not from Chile. They're definitely not a sea bass, but that's the popular name for them. And they're also known as white gold because they fetch such high prices in the market. They're sold in fancy restaurants and places like Whole Foods for a very high value. And so that's what's driving the fishery. They're very, very lucrative. And it's here in the United States that we actually import and consume the most amount of Chilean sea bass, but also in Europe and Asia. So toothfish are known as Chilean sea bass and white gold. They're also known, I learned when I went to Chile, as bacalao de profundidad, which I guess means cod of the deep. But I like to think about it as the profound cod, which is really how I think about toothfish. They're this amazing, I mean, look at that face, beautiful fish that's profoundly adapted to the waters of Antarctica. They actually have antifreeze proteins in their blood. So the waters of the Southern Ocean have salt, which keep it from freezing, but the fish's blood don't. And so they would actually freeze solid, except that they have these little antifreeze proteins that bind ice crystals and keep their blood from freezing. So these fish are just so superbly adapted to frozen place. And I found this fish when I was doing my master's at Moss Landing Marine Labs in California. And there was a new fishery in the Ross Sea, Antarctica in particular, and there was concerns that we didn't know enough about the fish. We wanted to know how old do they get? Where do they move throughout their life cycle? And so I fell into this really amazing project trying to understand more about the fish to inform management. Well, we did learn they grow very slowly, like a lot of deep dwelling fish. They live to be at least 40 years old. And again, this fishery was growing, and this is a fish that's vulnerable. And after becoming absolutely captivated with this animal, and hopefully you can see why now that you've seen a picture of it, it became what would be the rest of my career, really focused almost exclusively on trying to protect the waters around Antarctica. Now, I don't know, how many of you even knew we fished in Antarctica before today? Did most of you know that we did? Kind of, yeah. Well, for me, when I first went to Antarctica in 2005, I was really surprised. Like, I honestly didn't know we were fishing there. I was like, how did I get this cool project that's studying this commercial fishery? Why are we fishing in Antarctica? But it really is because we've overexploited the rest of the world's oceans. And for me, when I first went, it was so shocking because you have the worst oceans in the world, the biggest waves, the craziest winds. Fishers are literally risking their life to go out and fish there. But it reminded me of experiences I had right after college working on cod fishing vessels in New England. And New England was this place that was once abundant with cod. And now I remember the fishermen telling, God, we used to pull in fish as big as you, Cassandra, and now we're pulling in these little fish or we can't find cod at all. And it's that decline of those fish close to home in shallow waters that are driving us to literally the most remote places on the planet. The Ross Sea, Antarctica is the most remote fishery in the entire world. There's no further we can go. To bring home this point in a different way, this is a figure from the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, and all I want you to take home from it is that by 2017, 93% of our global fisheries were either fully or overexploited, 93%. What that means is there's just very few places left in the world where you can still grow fisheries, and Antarctica is one of them. So just to give you a sense of where fishing is in the Southern Ocean, that map in front of you in red is krill fishing, which again is concentrated in the Antarctic Peninsula. Krill fishing is allowed over here in the East Antarctic, but it's not currently happening because there's just not a lot of krill there that aggregates to be fishable. And then in blue are all your areas for Antarctic and Patagonian toothfish fisheries. So you can see those are scattered throughout. But who is fishing in the Southern Ocean? So currently it's about 12 to 14 countries that fish in any given season. You can see those by the maps. And each flag is a vessel from that country that notified to fish in the recent season. So you get a real sense of how busy this space is getting with a lot of vessels on the water and increasingly spreading throughout the Southern Ocean. So in the midst of this increasing fishing pressure, we have climate change. And if you've followed the news at all in the last few weeks, a few months, few years, you probably hear about Antarctica all the time. And the reason for that is it's undergoing this tremendous pressure where we have warming air, we have warming oceans, we have reductions in ice sheets and ice shelves, and of course, reductions in sea ice as well. And this, you don't have to pay attention to everything on this figure, but it's trying to summarize all those complex changes happening in Antarctica. We're also predicting increases in acidification and decreases in the amount of oxygen in the Southern Ocean, which is really bad for the animals that live there. And maybe you've heard in particular how this is starting to impact wildlife that live there. We've seen that Antarctic krill are starting to contract south, trying to move with those as the water warms north and moves south. And you've probably heard about some of the changes happening with penguins, in particular emperor penguins. I don't know how many of you have heard about emperor penguins in the Southern Ocean. And yeah, some of the changes happening there. So they've been predicted to potentially be extinct by 2100. But then a study just came out a month ago showing the first case of widespread breeding failure of emperor penguins because of the incredibly low sea ice in the last 2 seasons. So emperor penguins may not even have until 2100, like they're very much at risk of going extinct because of reductions in sea ice, which if you saw March of the Penguins, you probably saw how important that winter sea ice is for them. So here's the question. What do? We have this increasing fishing pressure. We have climate change causing all these changes. How do we maintain the ecosystem health and provide for sustainable use of fisheries? Well, marine protected areas are this increasingly popular tool. They're areas that you set aside for the sake of conservation or fisheries management objectives. And the reason they're increasingly popular is that they work. And I want to highlight this amazing figure, which really shows that, where within the protected area, if it's well designed and it's well managed, you get this abundance, explosion of marine life. You get a higher diversity, you get bigger animals, you get more of them. And the amazing thing is that's, of course, good for the things within the protected area. But what happens is that as they grow and get big, they spill out. It's called the spillover effect. They spill out of the marine protected area into this area that's open to fishing. So this is why not only are people who are just pushing conservation liking these, but again, if they're well designed and well managed, they're really good for the fishing industry too, because they can actually enhance fisheries. And maybe you've heard of the latest global targets. The Convention on Biological Diversity adopted a new global biodiversity framework just last December, calling for 30% of the world's oceans and land to be encompassed in protected areas. And this campaign is called 30 by 30. And we have a lot of work to do to get to 30 by 30, but that's what people are striving for now. So the reason that this matters for the Southern Ocean is that marine protected areas can actually enhance resilience to environmental change. And they do that by limiting all those other stressors. So if a system is stressed, but you reduce pollution and you reduce fishing and you reduce tourism and other stressors on the system, then you actually can give the system the best chance of being resilient and adapting to climate change. So that's why they're really important in the Southern Ocean. And CAMLAR, in line with their leadership, has actually been working on a network of marine protected areas for over 20 years in line with global targets. And they actually adopted their first MPA in 2009 and began working towards a network of protected areas that would encompass the whole Southern Ocean. And what the network is meant to look like, it's meant to encompass all the different forms of life in the Southern Ocean. And all you need to know from these 2 maps is that scientists have worked really hard to figure out what are all the different benthic habitats in the Southern Ocean, what are all the different pelagic habitats in the Southern Ocean, and to design a network of protected areas that would include pieces of all the colors on the map so that we can give, again, that system the best chance of being resilient. Now, immediately in this campaign, the Ross Sea was a priority area for protection when CAMLAR began working on this. And there are many reasons for that. One is that it was considered to be potentially the healthiest marine ecosystem, large marine ecosystem left in the world. This was a study that came out in Science in 2008, which mapped the impacts of human activity on the world's oceans. And the spectrum is from red to blue, where areas in red are your most damaged, your most hammered marine systems. And the areas in blue, which are very few on the map, are the areas that are left that are still intact or healthy or not damaged. And the Ross Sea in the study stood out as being perhaps the healthiest one left. The other thing is the Ross Sea is the most productive stretch of the Southern Ocean in terms of phytoplankton. This is a picture taken from outer space of NASA of that incredible phytoplankton bloom in the Ross Sea every year. The Ross Sea also supports this disproportionate amount of marine life. You have 1/3 of the world's Adelie penguins that live in the Ross Sea, 1/4 of the world's emperor penguins, and this amazing array of seals and whales and fish and benthic life. So the Ross Sea is also the best studied Antarctic continental shelf system. We actually have data sets going back more than 140 years. We have specimens that were first described from the Ross Sea as well. And I have to early on highlight the efforts of this man, Dr. David Ainley, pictured before you. He's an Antarctic ecologist who's based in California, originally from New England, like me, but moved to California originally to study marine systems and felt like both with New England and California, he was only studying marine ecosystems, and he really wanted to study something healthy. So we went to Antarctica to understand how a healthy marine ecosystem functions. And he saw the fishing industry come in the 90s early on and immediately began advocating that we need to protect the Ross Sea. Again, that we need at least one place left in the world that is healthy. And so as early as 2002, David began writing these obscure papers to CAMLAR. These weren't peer-reviewed articles, these were policy papers that he was writing, submitting directly to the policymakers, trying to advocate for a marine protected area there. And he began really galvanizing the support of hundreds of scientists to this effort. Now, early on, David's obscure papers found their way into the hands of conservation photographer John Weller, who lived here in Boulder, Colorado, and who had been actually looking for his next project. He'd been working in the sand dunes and was wrapping that up. And it was a high school friend who gave him some of David's papers. And John was captivated by these papers describing this last place left in the world that was still healthy and intact. And so John flew to California. He and David met, and they made this pact. David would organize and activate the science community, and John would use media to bring the Ross Sea to the world. And they began advocating for this place and branding it as the last ocean to really get it in people's minds of this last place left in the world. Early on, they brought on New Zealand filmmaker Peter Young to produce a documentary film and to lead the efforts of the last ocean in New Zealand. The reason we were targeting New Zealand is that the main fisheries for toothfish in the Ross Sea at the time were coming out of New Zealand. So we knew we needed an effort there. Now, during this time, I described that I was studying Antarctic toothfish and their life history in the Ross Sea, and I just finished my master's. And actually, I remember standing in front of my committee at my defense and saying, okay, we've learned toothfish are vulnerable. Like, we need a protected area in the Ross Sea, especially to protect these areas we know are really important for them. And I'll never forget my committee telling me to stop being emotional and that's an international space. You can't do marine protected areas in Antarctica. And so when John called me up and told me about the last ocean, and from my memory, he called me up and he said, we need to talk about toothfish. And I didn't realize at the time that that was a pickup line, but it was. And it wouldn't work on everybody, like that's for sure, but it worked on me. And John, if you know John, he's a very convincing human being. So he convinced me to join the last ocean, convinced me to marry him, have his kids, which are here in the room, and to spend the rest of my life in a landlocked Boulder, Colorado. Worth it, of course. And since we could not bring the public to the Ross Sea, we brought the Ross Sea to the public. This team of us, along with others, bombarded the world with media. We brought it to life and helped people understand what a global treasure the Ross Sea was. Peter in New Zealand produced this award-winning documentary film. It was actually shown here in Boulder, won some awards here at the film festival we have here every year. We also organized showings outside the CAMLAR meeting of this film. John produced this beautiful, critically acclaimed book, which I know some of you have in the room, and he delivered personally signed copies to all the delegates at CAMLAR. We worked with environmental groups, especially the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition and its members, to deliver policy-focused media. That's some of what you're seeing behind me. Writing policy documents that were produced in multiple different languages. We held photography shows. John offered his imagery to news outlets and partners. And John's images really became the face of the Ross Sea campaign worldwide. We gave hundreds of talks, we wrote articles, we produced shows, short films, just spread the word about the Ross Sea. And I'd like to think that we were enough to get people really fired up, but to elevate these issues, we really had to garner support from celebrities who could really maximize the reach of our imagery and messages. I'd like to think that we're as powerful as DiCaprio, but it turns out we're not. But he got behind this too, which is really cool. So during this time, I mentioned to you that CAMLR operates in this obscure building in Hobart, Tasmania, and they're closed to the public. Like, the public is not allowed in the CAMLR building. And so this is what the scene became outside of CAMLR, where the public is outside, they're rallying, they're holding protest signs in multiple different languages. They have these binoculars and these balloons with eyes on it. And what that's saying actually is, CAMLR countries, we know you're in there negotiating, you're doing it behind closed doors, we're watching you, we're paying attention to what you're doing, and we want you to take action on protecting the Ross Sea and the rest of the Southern Ocean too. And then in the midst of this public campaign, scientists, including David, but many others, generated an absolute flood of science in support of protecting the Ross Sea. And there was this amazing moment in 2010, so now 8 years into the scientific campaign, that the United States and New Zealand actually started developing a policy proposal for a protected area in the Ross Sea. And then they worked over many years to iterate on that proposal, and I'll get into that in a second, but trying to find trade-offs, a way to move forward with the proposal to get consensus. Now, I want to take you in the room at CAMLR. I know I'm not supposed to because it's close to the public, but I want to take you in here anyways and share with you what goes on. So this is the CAMLR meeting room. This is like the back of it. And these are all the decision makers. So all those different countries, and at the time of the Ross Sea, it was 25. Each country gets 2 seats at the table, one for a scientist and one for a diplomat, and then their advisors sit behind them. And every single one of these countries has to agree for us to get a policy path, every single one. And at this point, the first time a Ross Sea proposal came was in 2012. So if you're paying attention, that's 10 years into the science and public effort. We have this first policy proposal for a marine protected area that these countries can actually negotiate and vote on. And now in 2012 was the same year that I went back to school for a PhD at Stanford. And part of what motivated me to go is I had, of course, worked on the science side of things as a toothfish scientist. I had worked on the advocacy side and the media side of the last ocean, but I didn't really know what happened in this room. How did these countries actually make decisions? How was international policy made? And so when I went back for my PhD, I wanted to study this process, and I knew I needed to get inside this closed door room to understand what happened. But CAMLR was not open to the public. So it took some doing, but I was able to get on the delegation of the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, which is a conservation umbrella group who works in Antarctica. They're not allowed a seat at that voting table, but they are allowed an observer seat. And they kindly offered me a seat in the furthest back corner of the room at CAMLR, where I could study these negotiations and understand what went on inside the room. And I just want to share with you a little bit about what does this look like, this process of building to consensus. And so again, CAMLR had 25 countries at the time of the Ross Sea negotiations. And the way consensus usually works is that you have this period of countries that are introducing ideas, in this case about marine protected areas. We had countries who then were funding workshops, funding science, helping to pull together proposals. And then when that first proposal came in 2012, half the CAMLR countries supported it straight away, actually more than half. So if this was a majority organization, we would have adopted it right then, the first time it came to the table in 2012. But of course, it's not a majority organization, so we needed every country to agree. So if you pay attention to the map at the top, that's the 2012 proposal. Here's what it looked like in 2013. So a lot of these northern areas were removed, but that got the support of really important fishing countries like Norway and Korea, who had some concerns about the scientific uncertainty of those northern areas and also some fishing interests. So that was a compromise that happened. In 2013, CAMLR also had this special policy meeting where all they talked about was marine protected areas. They met outside of Hobart in Germany, and they had this special meeting in June outside when they normally meet, and that moved the needle too. That just gave countries time to talk. In 2014, even more countries joined in consensus. This was building on that momentum of the 2013 meeting, but also because of geopolitics. So before 2014, Ukraine voted in unison with Russia on everything. And of course, after the annexation of Crimea, they actually broke off, and since then have very much voted on their own at CAMLR, separate from Russia. So that left, at the end of 2014, 2 countries, Russia as the 2 not supporting the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. So there were a lot of challenges, as you can imagine, and this is many years of negotiations. I'm fast forwarding through. There are a lot of detailed stories in here. But first, I just want to highlight that something that was really hard is that there are no other international bodies adopting large-scale, no-take marine protected areas in international waters. It's just not happening. So CAMLR was the first body to do that. And so they had a lot of science to do. They had a lot of policy to develop in order to pull that off. The other thing is that I've mentioned to you this tension between fishing and not fishing in the Southern Ocean. And that wasn't just about who's fishing there now, but it was about who might want to fish there in the future. Or maybe a country isn't fishing in the Ross Sea now, but they might want to in the future. And so a lot of it was countries being concerned that protected areas were going to lock up the Southern Ocean from them being able to use them in the future. The other thing is that global geopolitics, of course, played out at CAMLR. And during some of these years, tensions were so high, although not as high as they are now, but they felt so high at the time between the United States and Russia. And of course, the United States was leading this proposal. And so there were these years where US would block everything Russia was doing. Russia would block anything the US was doing. And you just didn't have this political window of opportunity. But we needed Russia and China's support to get consensus. And it turns out that we needed it at the highest level. We needed diplomacy at the highest level. And so former US Secretary of State John Kerry turned out to be super important in this process. And it was in 2013 that National Geographic and the Pew Charitable Trust hosted this event in DC. They showed a version of The Last Ocean to him, and they got Kerry really fired up. And if you know anything about Kerry, you might know that he has this real passion for the oceans. He's led on ocean conservation domestically and abroad. And so when he found out the US was one of the countries pushing this, he took it on as something that he wanted to achieve during his term for it to be part of his legacy. And he proved incredibly important in this process and campaign. And the stories that we heard from our friends in the State Department and the White House is that Kerry was able to get Obama to incorporate a Ross Sea MPA into part of climate negotiations with China in 2015. And indeed, China comes to CAMLR in 2015, ready to negotiate and ready to support the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area. Now they asked for some things. And so one of the things I want to highlight that they asked for is this krill research zone that was tacked on to the western part of the Marine Protected Area. And this is a zone that allows for development of basically fishing for krill. I want to highlight there's never been krill fishing in the Ross Sea, so it wasn't really about them wanting to fish for krill there, but it was about them wanting to make sure that any future protected areas would have a krill fishing zone in it. The other thing that they negotiated was a limited duration so that the protected area would actually expire after a certain period of time. But they did support the MPA, and that left Russia as the last country not joining in consensus. So that brought us to 2016, where negotiations resumed, where we had this maybe potential political window of opportunity with Russia isolated. It was coming up on the end of Kerry's term. And throughout the year, worked really hard with his counterparts in Russia, really trying to find what could move this forward. At the same time, we had a potential opportunity for Russian leadership. Russia was chairing the meeting in 2016, meaning that they could provide leadership from within the room, which was really cool to see that happening. And then also Russia had declared this year of ecology. So they had a new ecology minister Kerry could engage with. And they also were coming up on celebrating their 200th anniversary of discovering Antarctica. That is contested by others, but they were celebrating it nonetheless. And partly we're trying to show leadership in Antarctica during this time. And so this meeting comes, this 2016 meeting, and the meetings last for 2 weeks. Again, we're in Hobart, Tasmania. And this meeting in particular in 2016 was really tense. We were there in the room, and then often we'd get kicked out of the room and the heads of delegation would meet. So that's just the top diplomat from every country would sit and meet quietly, and they would kick us all out of the room. And then we'd come back in the room and we'd think that we were there. And then another country would raise their hand with an issue. We'd get kicked out of the room again. And this went on for almost 2 weeks until finally the last night of the meeting, the chair came back and said, "We have consensus." And in that moment, the room exploded in applause. These like stoic diplomats wearing suits were shouting and jumping and hugging each other. John and I are in the back of the room crying. Some of the other scientists are crying. They worked on this for so long. And clearly this was a 14-year effort. So this was an incredible amount of work and time. And it was this huge thing that everybody was so proud of. And it was this amazing environmental win. To John and I, it felt like, yes, like we finally did this thing, but it felt like more than that. It felt like the signing of the Antarctic Treaty at the height of the Cold War. It felt like a diplomatic win. And it showed that despite incredible tensions between some countries, we can do extraordinary things in Antarctica. In this map, this picture that John took, he says it's his most important picture he's ever taken. This is New Zealand head of delegation, Gillian Dempster, and she's holding a map of the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area, which CAMLAR printed after it was adopted and invited all the delegates to come sign it. And I love this map because if you look around on it, you see Argentina, Norway, you see Australia, Korea, EU, Russia, US, Germany, you see all these signatures of these folks who were involved in this effort. And it was clear that it was an immediate source of pride for CAMLAR, and it should be, because at more than 2 million kilometers squared, this is the largest marine protected area in the world. And this picture is still framed in the office of CAMLAR, just such a source of pride. And there's John and I with our names on that map. So I'm obviously sharing with you my own very personal story. It's a very United States-centric view, and I need to highlight that this really was a global effort. We had diplomats from all the CAMLAR countries, hundreds of scientists, conservation groups from all over the world, and we literally had millions of individuals that were involved in this effort. And there's so many stories that we could share with you, but this one I want to share with you is of this British South African swimmer, Lewis Pugh, who actually went and swam in the Ross Sea to draw attention to it. And not only did he go swim in the Ross Sea, but he immediately flew to Russia so that he could go talk about how tough he was and crazy for swimming in the Ross Sea, and he almost died, and that they should protect it. And this became known in the news as Speedo diplomacy, where Lewis Pugh would go swim and then go and try to build diplomacy over this thing he did. And that's one story of so many that I could share with you about this effort of people really risking their lives in some ways to move this effort forward. So reflecting back, now that it's been years later and things do feel really difficult in CAMLAR now, how did we get consensus? Well, we very much worked at this interface between science and policy and the public. And I cannot underestimate the super important role of public engagement, that huge scientific effort that I've really fast forwarded through, that high level diplomacy that I talked about, those negotiating trade-offs, building trust, at times breaking and rebuilding trust, working with those opportunities for leadership, which really led to this amazing political window of opportunity. So the first question I always get when I talk about the Ross Sea is, will it be effective? It's this massive marine protected area, super remote. Whose responsibility is it? How is this going to work? Well, just to share with you, so this is the adopted protected area. It has 2 zones, the krill research zone, the special research zone, where fishing is allowed. But more than 70% of the protected area is completely off limits to fishing. It does expire in 35 years. That's that limited duration piece, unless there's consensus agreement to keep it in place. And so just to share with you, it is the responsibility of all the CAMLAR member states to do the research, the monitoring, their enforcement. And what I can share with you is that last year we had our first 5-year report of like what's happening in the protected area. Is it working? And I can share with you that there has been no illegal, unregulated, or unreported fishing that has been detected within the Ross Sea. That means no pirate fishing. It means that at least the countries that are fishing there are respecting the boundaries of the protected area. The other thing I can share is that we've compiled all the research ongoing in the protected area, and there are actually 460 projects that United States, New Zealand, Italy, and South Korea have been leading in the Ross Sea in support of the protected area. So we have an incredible amount of science happening there, which is really exciting. And we're all building towards this first review in 2027 of the protected area. For this first review, CAMLAR will scrutinize the marine protected area. They will ask, is it working? What else can we do? Should we change its boundaries? And so a lot of us are really focusing on this. We don't have a lot of time on this 2027 review. And you don't have to pay attention to everything on this figure, but just to share with you that with Sharon Stammerjohn and others, we've recently put in a proposal to the National Science Foundation about building a network to really get organized in research and monitoring in the Ross Sea. We have lots of gaps in our knowledge. We have countries working independently. And so this is a lot of what we're trying to do right now, get everybody organized so that we're really ready in 2027. So we have this amazing opportunity to use the Ross Sea as a model system for the rest of the world's oceans. How many of you are aware of this new treaty we have for the high seas? Is anybody aware of this brand new Yeah, thanks, John. I'm glad you're aware of it. No one else is aware of it. Okay. Oh yeah, awesome. My kids are aware of it too, they say. Okay. So we have this new treaty. It's been 20 years, almost 20 years in the making in the United Nations, where because of all the incredible threats to the international oceans, they've been working on this treaty. What is the international oceans? It's all those areas in light green on the map. It's 2/3 of the world's oceans are beyond national jurisdiction. They are the worst managed oceans in the world, so they're incredibly vulnerable. And yet, of course, being 2/3 of the world's oceans, they're incredibly important. And we had no way to really do biodiversity conservation in the high seas and not to do it well. And so for, like I said, almost 20 years, the United Nations has been meeting to try to form a new treaty. This treaty just passed in June, so this just happened. And it just opened for signatories this week. So it was just Wednesday that we had our first almost 70 countries sign the treaty, and then they have to ratify it, and then it actually comes alive. So I imagine by next year, this could be a real thing. And the amazing thing is, for the first time ever, this new treaty allows for marine protected areas in this international ocean. So this is why I think it's an exciting moment in the Ross Sea, because if we can do it well there, we can apply it to the rest of the world's oceans, which is super exciting. But let's come back to the Southern Ocean for a minute. So this is the Ross Sea Marine Protected Area here at the bottom of the map. The other protected area in the South Orkney Islands is there at the top. But as I said, CAMLR committed to this whole network of marine protected areas across the Southern Ocean. And we have 3 more proposals that are under negotiation right now at CAMLR. And I want to just tell you a little bit about each of these areas. So we have the East Antarctic, which is this super important area for birds and mammals, including vulnerable Adelie penguin colonies that have experienced breeding failure in recent years, probably due to climate change. We have the Weddell Sea, which, like the Ross Sea, but even more so, is a super intact marine ecosystem. Most places in the Weddell Sea have never been fished. And that area is really designed to not only protect the incredible amounts of birds and mammals there, but also the benthic environment, which is incredibly diverse. This is a picture of it up here. Every expedition that goes to the Weddell Sea, every time they send down a camera or a sediment trap, they find new species there. It's incredible. And so it's also an area that is not warming as fast as the rest of the Southern Ocean. And so it's also designed to be a potential climate refuge for those animals that need these cold environments. And I don't know how many of you picked up on the amazing ice fish nests that were found in the Weddell Sea just last year, but it wasn't just me excited about it. This is from the New York Times. How many of you saw this article in the New York Times last January? A few of you did. I feel like my family and friends. Great. Probably because I sent it to you. This was an amazing discovery. 60 million nests, 60 million ice fish nests found in the Weddell Sea within the area that's being proposed for protection. And you can see in this picture, so basically they dig out an area in the sand, they lay their eggs, and then the ice fish actually guard the nest. They stay there and guard them till they hatch. And if you don't know about ice fish, they're this extraordinary family of fish from Antarctica that don't have any hemoglobin. They don't have any red blood cells. They just have white blood cells, and that's why they kind of have this translucent skin. Their gills are white, their blood is clear. And it's because the waters of Antarctica are so rich in oxygen that they can just absorb it through their skin. Truly a remarkable fish. And finally, there's this region in the Antarctic Peninsula that's also being proposed for protection. This area is by far the most vulnerable. It's the area most rapidly changing from climate change with warming and sea ice loss. It's also the area where 70% of the krill are, so super important for these large aggregations of birds and mammals that come there. And then it's also where most of the krill fishing happens, because that's where most of the krill is. It's also the area where tourism is exploding. I don't know if you know that 100,000 tourists went to Antarctica in the last season, with 120,000 expected for next season. And they almost all go to the peninsula region. So this is an area like so much human use happening, and lots of impacts from climate change, and so really important for protection. And I want to highlight that one core objective of a lot of these is to provide this climate refugia. So we have areas left, we can protect the areas that are going to stay more cold, so that hopefully those animals have the best chance of adapting, including the emperor penguins. And just to share with you again how superbly adapted Antarctic life is. These are Antarctic silverfish, which are another important prey species. And this graphic is trying to show you their eggs and their larval and the adult fish. And those eggs are so tied to the sea ice. They depend on the sea ice for their life history. This is a beautiful picture Italian scientists got of these are eggs. These are Antarctic silverfish eggs. Eggs are full of antifreeze proteins, as are the silverfish, and they literally are laid in the platelet ice. When the ice breaks up, they pick up the currents, but they need that ice to stay still and intact and not be out floating around getting eaten while they're eggs. And so with reductions in sea ice in the peninsula, we're seeing reductions in these fish. Finally, my favorite species, the Antarctic toothfish, which again is so superbly adapted for Antarctica. So what's going to happen to them in a warming climate? This is a graphic of toothfish, and this is what we think their life cycle is, where they start on the shelf and slope. As adults, they spawn out on these northern ridges, and they come back to the Ross Sea shelf and slope. They're catching the Ross Gyre. This is a massive gyre system, very simplified version of it in the Ross Sea. And this is what we think toothfish do for their life history. And this is part of the work my group is doing here in Boulder too, is trying to understand what's happening as these currents change, as climate change is impacting the Ross Sea and the Southern Ocean, as this gyre, we think this gyre is changing, what's going to happen to toothfish, right? So as you can imagine, in recent years, it's been really difficult for lots of things, but including negotiating at CAMLR. We had 2 years where we met online, and Zoom diplomacy does not work, as you can imagine. We were negotiating across time zones, across technology issues, and so there were 2 years where we just got nothing done. And then, of course, we have, as I've mentioned, these growing interests in fishing the Southern Ocean, and for some countries, that's grown over the last few years. And then the last thing, of course, is Ukraine and Russia are both members of CAMLR. It's one member waging war against another, and that has just put CAMLR in a very difficult place for being able to negotiate anything. But I want to share with you that we are meeting next October. So in just a few weeks, we'll be meeting again in Hobart, Tasmania to resume negotiations. And all these different groups that are involved in this effort have continued that high-level diplomacy, the science, and getting public pressure and support. And this is where hopefully you got that impression from the Ross Sea. The public is so important in this effort. And I have the latest campaign hashtag up there for you. And these 5 groups at the bottom are the ones that are really involved in this effort and that any of you could get involved in if you're interested in learning more. Because here's the thing, even though things have been really difficult, if we learned anything from the Ross Sea, it's that we have to be ready for those political windows of opportunity. We don't always know when things will open up and happen again, but I think we have to be ready for those moments in time. Here's the thing too, though. We know that climate change threatens the Southern Ocean, and we know that fishing, as I've described, potentially further threatens those values. And so the question I might ask all of you, and I've been asking myself, is whether or not we even want to allow fishing to continue in the Southern Ocean. We know that Antarctica is so important to the Earth system and to potentially helping regulate climate change. And we know that whales are recovering. We know that a lot of these animals are vulnerable right now. And so this is the thing I've been grappling with a little bit right now, is how can we allow for fishing to continue given the threats to the system? So I used to give talks about Antarctica, calling for protecting this place for the sake of the life that makes its home there. And I used to share this story that in 2019, I returned from the Antarctic Peninsula after not having been to that region for 8 years. And I could scarcely find an Adelie penguin, my daughter's namesake. She wanted me to send her a picture of one. She's like, send me a picture of an Adelie, Mom. And I really had difficulty doing so because they depend on cold water and temperatures too. So they had really moved out largely from a lot of areas in the peninsula. And I used to make this call for protecting Antarctica so that my children, including my son, Orion Ross, named for the Ross Sea, could grow up in a Southern Ocean thriving with life. And while, of course, protecting Antarctica for the sake of its wildlife is still really important to me, it's become more visceral and personal in recent years. So I'll never forget the day in the middle of 2020 when I took my kids hiking on one of our favorite trails along South Boulder Creek. It was a beautiful summer day with the Rocky Mountains behind me, and suddenly the sky went dark. And I turned to see this massive cloud of smoke expanding out. It was blocking out the sun, and then this massive wave of ash came and it was raining down on my children and I. It felt like the end of the world, and I'm sure a lot of you remember this too. And then in that year, in 2020, that smoke continued for almost 4 months straight, where we were locked inside, where I felt like it wasn't safe for my kids to go out, as the beautiful, expansive forests of Colorado burned in ways they never had before. And then, of course, the next year with the Marshall Fire, with more than 1,000 houses burning, another record fire, this time in the heart of winter. And so the fires seem to continue with no end. It may have been better here in Colorado this year, but I remember going back to my home in New England and for the first time in my life, seeing smoke there that had just never happened before. It's like there's nowhere left that we can go. And I'm sure all of you have stories of fire or extreme events that have plagued you. And of course, the world is burning. It's warming dramatically. The early days of June this year saw us breach that 1.5 degrees C warming. And there's predictions from the World Meteorological Organization that we're likely to exceed that threshold for at least a year within the next 4 years. And that's when we cross that tipping point, that real 1.5 threshold, which we've been warned about will cause a lot of changes. But it's not hopeless. If you follow the recent IPCC reports, they've been calling for urgent climate action, but they've been suggesting that with immediate reductions in greenhouse gases, we can actually secure a livable future. And hopefully I've made very clear that Antarctica is absolutely core to that future. So this brings me back to here, Boulder, the work we're doing here. And I want to highlight the incredible privilege I've had to teach here at CU Boulder, and to really, so much of what I try to do with my teaching is to empower that next generation. This is their future, to raise their voices and to demand a livable future from policymakers and from people around them. And I have to highlight and acknowledge my amazing group of students, current and previous, there'll be future ones, who are all working tirelessly to understand the oceans and fish in Antarctica, who are studying policy and climate change and ways to make the world more just. And again, I want to thank all of you for coming out on a beautiful Saturday where you should be outside to spend this time for me. And thank you for all the work you do. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Wow. So thank you so much, Professor Brooks. Again, folks who are online, do feel free to submit your questions via that Q&A button, and we will work those in. Let's go ahead and see if there's any questions in the room. We've got a couple mics that'll be floating around. Please wait for someone to get to you. We've got right over here.
Yeah, Cassandra, thank you very much. One question kind of came to mind. I know there were 25, roughly 25 countries are in this treaty. Are there any issues around rogue ships who are stateless, or other countries who are not participating? And how do you enforce the rules to those folks?
Great. So yeah, this question of how do you deal with the pirate and illegal fishing? And yeah, there is still pirate and illegal fishing in other parts of Antarctica. I think the Ross Sea, because there's a lot of science that happens there. There's a lot of planes flying over and ships in the area, so we can enforce it a little bit better. But there's a lot of places that we can't, and we do find fishing gear that shouldn't be there. And there are vessels that have states that aren't real states attached to them, and they're out there fishing. So what CAMLR does is amazing, is that they do have a lot of measures in place that help with that. They have a documentation scheme for toothfish, which means every toothfish caught has this paperwork, or this electronic paperwork that goes with it, so that you can trace where the fish came from, that it was caught legally. Members of CAMLR have these port state measures where they will refuse to land catch if it was caught illegally. So it's not to say that the illegal catch can't find other ways in, but there are pretty, like, the main markets, including the US, like, will not import anything that doesn't have that documentation. And then CAMLR has like a black vessel list. So if there is a fishing vessel that was caught fishing, it gets put on that black list, including if it's from a non-CAMLR country. The problem with that is CAMLR is based on consensus. So there was one year, a couple of years ago, where Russia was caught fishing illegally, and they were able to keep their own vessel off that blacklist. But my understanding is they weren't able to sell the catch. Like, none of those main markets would buy the fish from that vessel. So those are the things that work pretty well within CAMLR, at least at bringing down the amount of illegal fishing, even though of course it still goes on to some degree. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Get you the mic. Oh yeah, please.
What about mining? You talked about protecting seas. Where is mining at, and that situation?
Mining, it's absolutely amazing. And this is where I think Antarctica is an example of how we could do things internationally and across the world. Mining is banned completely, both in the Antarctic continent and the seafloor around it. So there is no no future for mining in Antarctica. The only way that would go away is if all those countries agreed, because the treaty is consensus-based too. So all the countries would have to agree to get rid of that mining ban. And it's very unlikely that that will happen. And so that's another amazing thing. And there's a whole story around how that came to be. They were developing a mining regime for Antarctica for many years in the 80s. And it was this amazing turn of events through which there was a big oil spill in Alaska. People were getting really worried. Oh my gosh, what if there was an oil spill in Antarctica? Jacques Cousteau got involved. And instead of opening up, creating a mining regime, they just decided to ban it outright, which is really amazing. Yeah.
So from our online audience, and then we'll get the person up front. One participant asks, is farming fish the future rather than catching wild fish?
Yeah, so my understanding is whether we feature, it will be the future. Right now, there's a lot more farmed fish that feed people than wild fish. And so that in the projections are that to feed the world and the growing population, where people do really, a lot of populations need fish to live for their protein, that aquaculture will have to come in and fill that gap. We just can't continue fishing the oceans, as you've seen, to the extent we are. But what's really, and there are a lot of issues with aquaculture, but what I think is amazing is that there's a lot of innovations happening too. There's new efforts to grow multiple fish species together in polyculture in ways that are better for the environment. There's new fish meals being developed. We really don't need to be using krill. There's ways we're learning how to grow bugs in labs and other ways to feed fish. So I think those are the things we need to develop to make sure that aquaculture is done right. Yeah, great, thanks. That was your question. Great.
Great minds thinking alike.
I was interested in your mention of this new high seas treaty. How is that different from and improve upon the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea?
Great question. So the current framework we have for managing the international oceans is, the Convention on the Law of the Sea, which came into place through discussions in the 70s and came into force in the 80s. And that you're right, the Convention on the Law of the Sea has some nice language around needing to make sure that if we fish, we do so in a sustainable manner. But it puts all the emphasis on regional fisheries management organizations. So international fishing bodies then have to decide how they're going to fish. The difficult thing with that is that there's no language in there for like protected areas as a conservation tool. CAMLAR is different because they have a convention that allows for closed areas. It's like written legally into their convention, whereas most other international fishery organizations don't. So this new treaty is also trying to provide for protected areas, but also providing unification. Like right now in the high seas, in the international waters, you have one body that manages mining, one body that manages fishing, another body that manages whaling, another body that manages shipping. So you have all these different groups that manage the different activities. And the whole idea with the new treaty is to create an overarching framework that they'll have to actually work together. They'll have to actually figure out, okay, if this area is really important, how are we collectively, all these groups, going to work together? I think we don't know what it's going to look like yet. Like, it's going to be messy at first and will probably take 20 years to figure out. But CAMLAR is great for that too, because we have this Antarctic treaty system where it manages the continent, the waters around it. We have a mining ban. We have a lot of different regimes in place that work together, which again, I think could serve as a good model for how we could do that in the rest of the world's oceans. So to be determined. It's exciting though. Mike?
That might have been my mistake.
If you've riled people up, how do they get involved in the protection of Antarctica and the oceans?
John Weller has a question about if you rile people up, how do they get involved in the protection of Antarctic's oceans? Yeah, that's part of why I shared that slide of like, what are these different groups doing? We have amazing civil society organizations, including only one who John is working with now, the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. And there are these great bodies that actually attend CAMLAR and are working with governments and trying to really get people involved. I think like we did with the last ocean, you get the public informed and really excited. Antarctica is really far away. And so it's one of these places that I feel like we worked really hard and effectively at bringing Antarctica to people when you can't bring everybody to Antarctica. And then the diplomacy stuff, I think certainly surprised me at that high level diplomacy we needed. But this is part of working with groups that organize these high-level events. John's organizing this event in DC next week that we're all going to. That's hopefully going to get some of the right people in the room to make these decisions. But I feel like there's so much that people can do, whether it's through learning or teaching or getting involved in some of these organizations. Yeah. thanks
So
for that
a
question.
related question from online. Are there any environmental nonprofit organizations specifically that you would recommend for donations if folks are interested in giving money to support this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the ones that I put on I can pull those back up again. Actually, that'd probably be a good thing to do. Get all my students out of the way. Hold on. Is Actic Leah? Stand up for a sec. I didn't put your photo up there because she's technically not at CU yet in my lab, but Leah's a high school student who's been working on Antarctic toothfish otoliths through ear bones to help us with the aging process. So thank you so much for your work. So exciting. But yeah, these groups, I'd say in particular, the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, hopefully you guys can see it behind the podium here. This group is the one that goes to CAMLR. They serve as this umbrella group, and they've been doing amazing work for decades in the Southern Ocean at this on this campaign. This is the work that Only One is the group that John works with. We work closely with Pew as well. And of course, Greenpeace and WWF is huge. NGOs are really involved too. So I think any of these groups, you can look up like where their Southern Ocean campaign is, and they all, I feel like we're always operating on very little funding, so.
So maybe I can get one more online in that's perhaps related, and then we'll go back to folks in the room. This initiative involves activism as well as scientific inquiry. Are there any points or examples at which those two elements were in tension, or were those complementary throughout, do you think?
That's a great question. And yeah, and I think it's one I've thought a lot about too. And in the particular with the last ocean, yeah, you heard that like we had to do the science. The science was super critical to the effort. That advocacy effort was also super critical. And I think in the context of the last ocean, I certainly never felt like those two things were in conflict. They seemed complementary. But I will say that throughout the process, you know, I've certainly had people tell me that as a scientist, I shouldn't be raising my voice or I shouldn't be advocating. And this is where having mentors like David Ainley, who I found so inspiring, like as a young scientist who had already been told, don't advocate, don't be emotional. And then to see this older male scientist being the biggest advocate ever, and just being able to like have those people as role models and be like, no, like that's who I am, right? A person who has values. And I think there's a role for us as scientists. We're humans too, and we have values and we have things we care about. And I think it would be false to pretend that we don't, even though I realize not everybody is comfortable being in that space. But I'm very comfortable advocating science, if that's not clear. But not in this case. Sometimes they could be.
Gretchen, I think we got someone down here.
So would you advocate for avoiding products, at least knowingly, that contain krill? Because I had read that the krill populations are endangered, so I don't buy omega-3s that are made from krill. Obviously, if you eat farmed fish, then you're eating it whether you know it or not.
Right. That's a good point. Farmed fish, pigs, chickens, like when you buy your eggs and they're like full of omega-3s, and you're like, why are they full of omega-3s? Because it depends on what the chickens are eating. Yeah, and this is where, so yes, so Antarctic krill, we think they're declining potentially. They're definitely contracting south. They're definitely at risk from climate change. And so me personally, and this is where there's like me as a scientist, me as a human being, like I don't feel right eating krill products or Chilean sea bass, even though some scientists will say they are sustainable for now, that we're catching them at a low enough level. I would say maybe we are, but are we factoring in the recovery whales? Are we factoring in the penguins and all the things that also eat it? It's like we're now a predator competing with these other animals. So I think it's an important thing to think about. We all have to eat. I feel like this is one of the hardest things to talk about. We all have to eat. We all need protein. So I think it's just that making those choices to the best of our ability. Yeah. Thank you for your difficult question.
Okay, so we can go to an online question. An anonymous attendee wonders, how would a marine protected area on the peninsula impact the growing tourism industry? Would it be banned or limited to limit the impact on marine life? And I think a related question here on a lot of folks' mind is, I think there's the notion that exposure to some of these amazing natural environments really does build people's passion for protecting them. So how do you balance that consideration of tourism, more people getting to experience these things versus protection?
Yeah. So yeah, the whole question of tourism, and the thing with tourism is that it really exploded post-COVID. There were a lot of people who were supposed to go in the COVID years who couldn't go, and then now are really wanting to go. And unfortunately, I think there's also a lot of people who want to go and see it before it's gone, which I find very morbid. But yeah, I think what's going to happen with tourism in the peninsula, there's the International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, and they're a group that helps manage tourism. And they've been doing a study of trying to understand how they can limit their impact. So where are areas that they can go or shouldn't go, where are areas that are vulnerable. So they are trying to do some work to manage people's impacts. But 100,000 is just, it's going to be 120,000 too many for that one area. So I think we'll have to see how that goes. If there is a protected area, that really will limit fishing. It won't necessarily limit where tourism goes, because that's managed under this other kind of tourism body. So, but they will work together. And so if and when that passes, I think we'll have to see how that relates. The question of, yeah, there's this whole notion, right? If you take someone somewhere, then they become an ambassador, they fall in love with the place. I know very few people who went to Antarctica and didn't leave absolutely loving it and wanting to protect it. So I think that's a really good point. And I think we probably have to allow for some going there, but maybe we have to do it more intentionally and figure out ways to not have it maybe be so widespread, and maybe just use better. We have such amazing media and technology. Like I've heard people talk about having like virtual Antarctica and virtual oceans, and maybe there's ways that people can experience these places without damaging them, because there is obviously a huge carbon footprint to going to Antarctica, and it would be impossible to not, impact the wildlife in some way with having some of these huge vessels go down there. So yeah.
Any other questions in the room down here? Is that, oh no.
We got a couple on the back.
You mentioned a little bit that the emperor penguin might be threatened of going extinct, and clearly that's a wildly popular animal. Do you think that there's any room to get something like an Endangered Species Act happening within Antarctica to protect to protect the emperor penguin and other such creatures?
Thank you for coming out, and thank you for that question. Good to see you again. Yeah, so I should have mentioned the United States actually listed the emperor penguins as an endangered species last year because of how threatened they are by climate change. I don't know how that's going to help. I sort of feel like we'd have to back that up with like commitments to reduce our emissions if we really mean that, and I haven't seen that yet. The other effort that's happening is within the Antarctic Treaty System of trying to list emperors as protected there too, and then the treaty parties would have to do more to safeguard them. But with the emperors, I mean, protected areas certainly won't hurt them, but they won't save the emperors. Like it really is a global climate change question there, and I think there's still a window in which like they don't have to go away. And I think what's been so sad about the recent studies is people thought, oh, they seem to move around a little bit, or there's places on the ice sheets that they're breeding to, and maybe that'll be more stable. And this new study that just came out showed that even on the ice sheet, because they need the sea ice to get up and down off the ice sheet, they still had breeding failure. And a lot of it is like, yeah, the chicks are on the ice and the sea ice breaks up too fast and they don't have like their adult feathers yet. And so they can die. And then of course the males and females switching on the eggs, and occasionally they have to abandon the egg if the female doesn't come back because you can't get back to the nesting ground. So there's like these complicated stories with the emperors. But my understanding is like there is still these windows if we reduce emissions, that emperors won't be gone. And I hope that people can understand that. Like this is one of the most iconic species on Earth. We've never had an extinction in Antarctica. Like nothing's gone extinct yet, which is really amazing. And it would be crazy to think that emperors would be the first thing to go, that they're incredibly vulnerable. So yeah. Someone asked me a happy question.
In your Ross MPA diagram, there were two island-like areas.
Yeah.
and they seem to have sustained protection.
Yeah.
There's something significant about those areas offshore. Just interested in the weeds of how those were protected. Is there
Yeah.
something under the sea that's important, or the life?
Yeah, there is. So you mean these two areas in the north, right? Yeah, great. So that area marked with the three little Romans is a seamount system, Scott seamount. And so it's, yeah, really the seamount system that has a lot of life there. So that was able to be protected. And then the other one further north than that is part of that ridge, this amazing Pacific Antarctic ridge system. And so when I showed you that graphic of the toothfish spawning, that's where we think toothfish spawn, is on that ridge system out north. And so that was an area that was negotiated to at least protect a little bit of their spawning grounds. The original proposal had a lot more of their spawning grounds in there, so that's a little bit of a bummer that that was taken out. But at least a chunk of it is still in there. But that's what that's about. Thank you for that question. I'm like, I'd love to tell you every detail of why the boundaries look the way they do. There's so many stories in there.
So an online participant named Ben has stated, thank you so much for sharing your incredible stories of Antarctica and your research. You discussed the accidental capture of whale calves in krill nets. Is there ongoing research you're aware of for alternative krill fishing methods to mitigate this? And maybe whether changes to fishing strategies in general can impact the situation?
Yeah, that's a really great question on what are we going to do about the krill fishing and the whale interaction. And I just want to bring up that picture again because, yes, there's a lot of great work being done right now where actually after those juvenile humpback whales were caught, like nobody wants to catch a humpback whale. Like that's not great for the fishing industry, certainly not great for the whales. And so some of those fishing groups did meet with the IWC, which is the International Whaling Commission, and got some tools for how they could modify their nets. And so they haven't caught them in this last season based on those modifications. The one thing that they haven't done yet that they really need to do, and these discussions are really, this is happening right now. Like, so these discussions are progressing like literally last year and this year and into next year on how do we manage krill, including whales. And one of the things I hope they do is to make rules about you can't fish on whales. Like if you see whales, you can't fish there. Like that's a simple, to my mind, a simple rule. But I have looked up, like, are there other international bodies that have rules about not fishing on whales? And it's not very common, which is crazy to me. So we don't have a lot of good precedent about those rules, but those are some of the things that people are talking about. It's like, if you see whales, you can't fish, and modifying gear to make sure that we don't interact with the whales. Yeah, thank you.
Any other thoughts or comments in the audience here? Great. So we've got a couple more online, and we have time for those, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. In that case, a question about lessons learned in terms of science communication. Is there any advice, Professor Brooks, that you give colleagues, other researchers or scientists about engagement beyond academia in terms of pressing public issues?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's super clear that I'm someone that feels very strongly that we should be communicating as scientists. It's not part of our job. We're not paid to do that. And so I think that's the challenge. And I feel like I did more of it before I had kids. Just time is more of an issue. But I do think making space for it, and whether it's, I mean, coming out and giving a public talk, or whether it's talking to the media, which I definitely make time to talk to the media when I can. And then whenever I go to Antarctica, at least I try to do media from there to be a lens to that place and the issues that are happening there. And that's all stuff that, again, I feel strongly about. But what's amazing, I think, is that this next generation of scientists are doing it anyways. Like, it's just part of what they're doing. They're doing social media. They're really comfortable writing, taking pictures, putting themselves out there. And it doesn't seem to be maybe as hard, or they don't feel as vulnerable doing it maybe as I did. So that's really inspiring, where I do think the young scientists are doing it, and I'm really glad they're doing it. And I definitely, through my teaching and even my lab group, like, I try to encourage students to do media and to get involved in any ways they can. And that includes sometimes connecting them here at CU with our media office, and making sure we're writing articles and doing other things around outreach. So yeah, I think super important. And I actually feel like it's an obligation that as scientists, we hold all this information, and a lot of it's really important to like our survival and to the survival of a lot of things living on the earth. And I feel like we can't just publish it in peer-reviewed articles and kind of hold it close to ourselves. We have to get it out there in the world. So it just takes extra effort.
All right. So one final question for you today. If someone wanted to do your job, to become a researcher who makes a difference on policy issues, do you have any advice for younger folks that would be interested in that path?
Yeah, I think one of the things, I feel like John and I both said this to people when they ask us that kind of question, is staying true to your own values and really doing things you're passionate about. And I do feel like there was, like I told you, a period of time where people were like, don't be an advocate. I even had some other science poly sort of tell me, stay away from David Ainley, stay away from these scientists who are advocating. You're going to jeopardize your entire career and not be a scientist that people take seriously. And I feel like obviously that didn't happen. And a lot of that was just staying true to your own values. And I don't think everybody wants to work at the science policy interface. It's pretty messy. It's really difficult. And again, I don't feel like part of my job is necessarily go to policy meetings and write policy papers that no one's ever going to read. But I do feel like that's something that feels really important to me, and certainly my group of students as well. But it's not, I think everybody, a colleague said this to me once, and I love it, is like, you have to find your own superpower. And I think whatever that superpower is, I feel like it took me a long time to realize that mine was the interdisciplinary space between science policy and the public. I think I felt confused for a long time because I thought I was supposed to be a scientist, but I liked the public engagement and then I liked the policy. And I realized that's me. That's like where I belong. But I think everybody's got to find their own, like, what's their strength? What's their superpower? What are they really good at? So, so I love that I get to operate in that space, but it's certainly not for everybody.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Brooks. Everyone, please join me in appreciating Professor Brooks for, thank you.
Okay.
So what an amazing set of stories and the expertise shared today. I have been riveted myself, and I imagine we all have. So much information and so much thought-provoking, and I think really inspiring information about ways that big things can get done. I think in a media, landscape that covers a lot of our political situations that at least I often feel pessimistic, I think stories like this really do show a different way that things can go. So I'm really grateful for that. To everyone who joined in person and online, we appreciate your time and participation, your wonderful questions. I'd also, again, one more time, like to appreciate the staff of the Office for Outreach and Engagement for work behind the scenes to produce these events. You all make this possible. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's entirely called for. Professor Brooks is a great example of what the kind of significant research being done by our faculty at CU Boulder can look like. I'd be lying if I said everyone was as dynamic and engaged as Professor Brooks, but we have around 2,400 faculty here at just the Boulder campus. And this, if you imagine what you've seen today and expand that across disciplines and fields, issue areas, you can get a sense of the significance of a place like CU Boulder to global issues as well as locally. And so we really, really appreciate y'all's support being part of this intellectual community that we build here through CU on the weekend and other outreach events to draw attention to that work that's being done here. So we do have another upcoming event in line with that remark there. Oh, and I almost forgot. Thank you. Here we are. Our next event is on Friday, November 3rd. This is part of Homecoming. We are collaborating with the Alumni Association, and we'll have our instructor, Travis Rupp, from the Classics Department. He's known colloquially as the beer archaeologist. He's going to be talking about how we define what counts as beer in the ancient world. We hope you join us for that. We'll be in person in this room as well as online. If you want to attend online, be sure to register for the event in advance. So finally, we'd like to invite you to complete a survey today. You can see a QR code on the screen. You can hold your smartphone camera up to that, and it'll take you to an online survey. We also have paper versions for those of you that prefer that old-fashioned method with the pen and pencil. Gretchen, near the exit to the room here, has some paper surveys. Raise your hand if you'd like one of those. We really appreciate your feedback on this event. It helps us to think through what topics, what type of faculty members and research we'd like to chase down for future events. So please fill out that survey. Let us know what we can do better. Finally, thank you again, especially on such a wonderfully weathered day outdoors. Beautiful weather today, and your time with us is a valuable thing. So we hope to see you on the weekend again, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.